Fine, I'm leaving and I'm taking the kids with me. The words hit you like a physical blow. Or maybe you hear it with cold calculation. If you do not give me what I want, you will never see your kids again. In that moment, your world tilts on its axes. Every protective instinct in you screams to prevent this catastrophe. Your children's faces flash through your mind. Bedtime stories, weekend adventures, school events you might miss forever. These words don't just create fear, they demand a sacrifice. Each threat forces you to imagine an unbearable loss: your children, your home, your reputation, your sense of self. The message becomes crystal clear. Your independence will cost you everything you hold most dear. You are being systematically trapped through the weaponization of what you love most. Your natural desperation to protect what matters becomes a very mechanism that cages you. The threat translates simply: your freedom requires losing what you cannot bear to lose. This is psychological entrapment, one of the most sophisticated forms of imprisonment in abusive relationships. It transforms your deepest values, your strongest bonds, even your love itself, into weapons used against your freedom. That is the focus of today's episode: the threats that entrap you within an abusive relationship. We'll break down six of the most common threats abusers use to keep you locked inside their world. We'll look at how these tactics work, why they cut so deeply into a man's psychology, and the practical countermoves that might help you protect some of your freedom. One important note before we dive in: this episode will not cover suicide threats. That subject is complex and sensitive, so I've dedicated a separate video to it in the link above. We also won't be covering what happens when an abuser actually follows through on these threats, like spreading rumors or filing false allegations. Those scenarios will be handled in separate future episodes. Today, our focus is specific: the threats themselves and how they are used to trap you. For those of you who are new here, I'm a certified trauma coach with more lived experience than I ever wanted. I built Stand Again to give male victims of family violence a voice. Abuse happens across genders, but men's experiences are too often dismissed or misinterpreted. If this content helps you, please like, subscribe, and type the words "stand again" into the comments. Those two words might just help a victim of abuse find his. Let's get into this. This form of entrapment represents a system that makes leaving feel impossible by linking freedom to the loss of what you value most. These tactics are specifically designed to make departing the relationship appear to lead inevitably to the loss of your children, your reputation, your social connections, or even your sense of self. The fundamental architecture works by targeting identity. The abuser identifies what you cannot bear to lose: your children's daily presence, your sense of integrity, your professional standing, your place in your community, and creates direct links between leaving the relationship and losing those core aspects of who you are. The message becomes inescapable. The threat frames leaving as the destruction of everything that makes you who you are. When someone threatens to destroy you across multiple domains simultaneously, they create decision paralysis, where every path forward appears impossible. Your decision making process shifts from "should I leave this relationship" to "how can I possibly survive what they're threatening to do to me?" Your rational assessment becomes completely focused on preventing the threatened destruction while being unable to address the underlying problems within the relationship. The timing of these mechanisms is crucial to their effectiveness. They typically emerge when you begin building resources that might enable departure, developing opportunities that could provide independence, or showing signs of calculating exit strategies. The abuser recognizes that their control is being challenged and escalates to ultimate threats designed to remind you of everything you cannot bear to lose. Each threat reinforces a psychological prison. You cannot leave because the price is the destruction of who you are. The sophistication lies in how these threats create a sense of sunk cost entrapment. You feel simultaneously completely responsible for protecting what you value most while being entirely powerless to create genuine change within the relationship. Instead, you work to prevent catastrophe by complying. The abuser's threats work on several levels at once. They often shut down any immediate plans to leave because the threatened consequences feel unbearable in the moment. They also linger long after the words are spoken. Once the fear is planted, you start making every future decision through the filter of what if she carries this out. And over time, your energy shifts entirely towards protecting what is being threatened, whether that's your children, your reputation, or even your livelihood, instead of building the independence that might one day allow you to leave. For someone living through this, the impact cuts deep. It becomes almost impossible to picture a future outside of the relationship that does not involve losing everything you care about. That is not weakness. It's a conditioned response to constant threats that have tied leaving with total destruction. The dynamic no longer feels like a relationship, it feels like a hostage negotiation. Every time you try to set a boundary or state a need, you're hit with reminders of what you will lose if you keep pushing. Ordinary conversations start to feel dangerous because you're constantly calculating the risk. Is this worth raising or will it cost me everything? Life shifts into constant prevention mode. You watch her moods, anticipate when she might escalate, and change your behavior to keep the balance just steady enough to avoid disaster. Energy you should have for work, your kids, or simply living your life gets drained by the endless work of managing threats. What makes it especially cruel is how it's disguised as normal. The threats are often wrapped in language that sounds, on the surface, reasonable. If our marriage ends, of course there will be changes. Or, I just want you to understand what separation really means before you make any hasty decisions. There's just enough truth in those statements to make them believable. But the intent is to trap you into thinking freedom is the cost of what is so dear to you. And over time, the threats don't just keep you in place, they create a twisted form of dependency. You become more attached to the very person making the threats because they seem to be both the danger and the only way to avoid it. That double bind locks you in a loop where survival feels dependent on keeping them satisfied, even as it slowly erodes you. Let's now look at 6 specific threats you may hear in an abusive relationship. Starting with what sounds like a contradiction, which is the threat of leaving. On the surface, it looks like freedom. If your partner says they might leave, it sounds like the door is open. In reality, abandonment threats are one of the more powerful forms of entrapment. They destabilize your foundation and make you cling tighter, sacrifice more, and fight harder to prove your value. When you hear, maybe I should just walk away then, or one day you'll wake up and I'll be gone, these aren't neutral statements. They are verdicts on your worth. The message is clear. You are not valuable. You are not worth staying for. You have failed at being someone worth choosing. The mechanism is direct and brutal. The abuser positions themselves as the sole judge of your value. Every threat carries a message that your place in the relationship is conditional, temporary, and dependent on their shifting standards. This tactic attacks the core of identity. It convinces you that you are inadequate, disposable, and replaceable. Your sense of being valued, chosen, and wanted collapses when it becomes dependent on someone else's verdict. The trap closes quickly. You stop evaluating their behavior and start evaluating yourself. You work harder to prove you are worth staying for. So you overcompensate, you sacrifice more, and you appease further. You are not driven by fear of independence, but by fear of being confirmed as worthless. Every threat destabilizes the ground beneath you. A normal disagreement becomes a referendum on your adequacy. A simple request becomes a sign you are too demanding. An expression of stress becomes proof you are too much to handle. The message is constant. Your worth is fragile, provisional, and always under review. The language used is precise and cutting. I don't think this is working anymore. Lands as a declaration that you are inadequate. Maybe I'll be happier with someone else. Suggests you can be easily replaced. I can't keep dealing with this. Frames you as a burden. These are not statements about the relationship, they are statements about your value. In time, you adapt by shrinking yourself. You silence your needs. You suppress your emotions. You swallow desires, and you become whatever you think will prevent the next abandonment threat. Your instincts to love, care, and commit are twisted into evidence that you are desperate and unworthy. Abandonment threats transform your deepest capacity for attachment into the very tool that binds you. The more you care, the more powerful the threat becomes. The more you invest, the more proof she has that you have more to lose. The more you commit, the more she can make you believe that your worth is never enough. The next is the threat of taking the kids. Custody threats are among the most devastating forms of entrapment because they target what is most precious: your children's daily presence in your life. The abuser ties your autonomy to the risk of losing them, creating a prison built from your protective instincts. Every fiber of your identity as a parent becomes the lever for control. These threats work because they strike at the core of who you are. They tell you that choosing independence will cost you your children. They tell you that any step away from compliance to their demands means losing bedtime routines, school pickups, shared meals, and the ordinary moments that make up family life. The message is brutal and unmistakable. Freedom means absence from their life. The credibility of custody threats is what makes them uniquely powerful. In many family law systems, fathers know they face disadvantage. The abuser does not need to prove her case for this threat to work. She only needs you to believe she could follow through. That belief is enough to paralyze you. It keeps you cautious, hesitant, and constantly second guessing your own moves. The threats are very rarely vague, they are deliberate, rehearsed, and frighteningly specific. She might say, I'll tell the courts about your anger management issues. I'll show them you can't manage the kids on your own. I always do primary custody anyway. I'll demand full custody and you'll be reduced to visits every second weekend at best. Each line is crafted to sound like an inevitable outcome, not an empty threat. The detail gives the words their weight. Custody threats also appear at very precise moments. They surface when you start building independence, when you make plans that could give you space, when you take steps that might weaken her control. The timing reveals their purpose. The message is always the same. Your access to your children depends entirely on your compliance to her demands. The effect on your psyche is profound. Every disagreement feels dangerous because it could be reframed as proof you cannot co parent. Every show of frustration risks being painted as instability. Even ordinary stress becomes something you fear will be documented and used against you. You learn to police yourself at all times: your tone, your words, your expressions, not to model good parenting, but to avoid handing her more material for her threats. What begins as a tactic quickly becomes a full system of control. Normal conflicts about schedules, routines, or parenting choices are no longer about what's best for the children. They become tests of your right to remain in your children's lives at all. Every boundary you set, every moment you assert yourself, carries the implicit risk that she will escalate into custody threats. The damage is cumulative. You withdraw from situations where conflict might arise. You avoid expressing needs. You bend further and further and further. not because you believe it will lead to cooperation, but because you are terrified that resistance will be used to justify your removal from your children's life. The fear reshapes your entire life. Custody weaponization and traps by transforming fatherhood itself into a conditional privilege. Your relationship with your children is recast as something she can grant or take away, rather than something that belongs to you by right and responsibility. Each threat reinforces that you are only allowed to remain a father on her terms. Next is threats of social isolation. Threats of social isolation weaponize the connections that give your life meaning outside the relationship. They target the friendships, family bonds, and community ties that form your social identity and provide the support you need to stay grounded. The abuser turns these into weapons by making your access to them conditional on your compliance, creating a prison where autonomy appears to cost the destruction of your entire social world. This tactic works because we as humans are deeply social. We need connection, not only for emotional well being, but also for our sense of identity. The people we trust most, like our parents and siblings and longtime friends and colleagues, and even the community we're a part of, they become a part of who we are. The abuser recognizes this and links your independence directly to the loss of these social ties. The threat often takes the form of character assassination. You might hear things like, I will tell your family who you really are, or I'll make sure your friends know what you have done, or even people will see the real side of you. On the surface, these might sound like exposures of hidden truth, but in reality, they are distortions, exaggerations, or outright fabrications. The abuser leverages your fear that others will believe their version of events, turning false allegations into a weapon that poisons your social world. Because family, friends, and community are central to your sense of self, the idea of being cut off, misunderstood, or rejected on the basis of lies is psychologically devastating. The fear of being excluded from family gatherings, abandoned by close friends, or branded within your community creates pressure so intense that it overrides the rational judgment about the relationship itself. So you stay, you comply, you appease, not because the allegations are true, but because the risk of losing your entire social identity feels unbearable. When isolation has already taken hold, the few remaining connections carry even greater weight. If you have already been cut off from most of your friends and family, the abuser may target your workplace or a community you are part of, or the one or two people still in your life. This magnifies the pressure because the potential loss of those final supports feels catastrophic. The psychological weight of this entrapment is enormous. You are forced to choose between protecting your social identity and protecting your autonomy, knowing that either choice carries unbearable cost. The very people who should provide relief and perspective instead become symbols of risk. The abuser has turned your strongest protective network into another set of prison bars, making your freedom feel indistinguishable from social annihilation. Next are threats of financial devastation. Financial devastation threats weaponize your most basic need for security. They make independence feel indistinguishable from ruin. The message is clear. If you try to leave, you will be stripped of resources, buried under legal costs, and left unable to sustain yourself or your children. The abuser who uses this tactic understands that money is not just about comfort, it's about survival, stability, and dignity. They know that insecurity strikes fear at a primal level, especially after years where your role has been twisted into serving their needs. Often you are made to provide while being denied autonomy over what you provide. You earn, but they manage. You contribute, but they control. Over time, they build a system where your labor fuels the household, yet your access to its benefits is restricted by them. And then they threaten to destroy you financially if you ever attempt to step outside their system. The sophistication lies in how abusers engineer dependency long before the threats are spoken aloud. They set up joint accounts that they control, make major assets conditional on their name, run up debts in ways that leave you exposed, and undermine your financial confidence by framing you as irresponsible or even incapable. Years of this conditioning means that by the time they threaten to bankrupt you, the ground has already been prepared. You believe it because they've arranged the circumstances to make it credible. The threat is reinforced by the brutal realities of the legal system. Abusers often walk into court positioned as the dependent party, despite years of living off your earnings and labor. They frame themselves as vulnerable, while you are framed as the capable provider who can afford to lose more. The result is financial outcomes that reward the abuser's exploitation. They secure support, assets, and favorable arrangements while you are left carrying obligations that make rebuilding nearly impossible. It is one of the most demoralizing dynamics male survivors describe. You serve for years inside the relationship, and then the court system formalizes that servitude when you leave. The credibility of these threats make them uniquely effective. I'll take the house and leave you with nothing. You'll pay me support for decades. My lawyer will drag this out until you are bankrupt. These are not idle statements. They echo realities you have already seen in other men's cases or in your own. The fear is not theoretical, it's lived, visible, and terrifying. The psychological impact is corrosive. You begin to doubt your ability to survive without their resources or within the system they have created. You stop exploring opportunities for independence because every step towards autonomy feels like you're inviting financial annihilation. You become paralyzed, caught in a loop where compliance feels like the only way to protect yourself from being stripped of everything you built. Cruelty of this tactic is that it doesn't just threaten your wallet, it attacks your will. It makes security feel conditional on your silence, on your obedience, on your willingness to remain trapped within the abusive relationship. It convinces you that the cost of freedom is not just high, but impossible to bear. Next is the threat of the abuser's self destruction. Self destruction threats represent a particularly insidious form of entrapment that transforms your natural protective instincts into psychological chain. The abuser claims they are entirely dependent on your presence for their basic stability, mental health, or functional capacity. They position themselves as fundamentally unable to cope without you, making your departure equivalent to causing their complete deterioration. These threats weaponize your sense of responsibility and your natural inclination to help those who appear vulnerable. The abuser convinces you that they cannot help themselves and that no one else possesses the unique ability to keep them stable. This creates a trap built from your own compassion, where leaving feels like abandoning someone who will collapse without your constant presence and support. The distinction between genuine calls for help and weaponized vulnerability is crucial. When someone is genuinely struggling, they typically seek multiple sources of support, accepting professional help, and maintaining some level of functionality independent of any single relationship. Weaponized self destruction threats are conditional, timed strategically, and accompanied by explicit or implicit refusal of alternative support systems. The message becomes clear: you are solely responsible for preventing their deterioration. The mechanism operates through several interconnected psychological hooks. The abuser convinces you that your departure will directly cause harm to someone who depends on you completely. This creates both fear of causing damage through your actions and a sense of unique responsibility for preventing that damage. They position themselves as helpless, while positioning you as their only source of stability, which feeds into this human need to feel valued and necessary. The threat transforms leaving from a personal choice into what feels like abandoning someone in crisis. The specific language used reveals the manipulation clearly. Without you, I'll start drinking again. Creates direct causation between your departure and their self destructive behavior. You might also hear, "You're the only thing keeping me sane." Positions you as human medication whose withdrawal will cause mental collapse. Or you might hear, "I can't function when you're not here," framing your presence as essential for their basic survival capabilities. Or even, "If you leave, I'll stop taking my medication and going to my appointments," which weaponizes medical compliance as a hostage situation. Abusers employ this tactic because it provides multiple strategic advantages that make it particularly difficult to recognize or resist. The threat weaponizes cultural narratives about helping the vulnerable and supporting those in need. Society teaches us that abandoning someone who depends on us is morally wrong, and the abuser exploits this social conditioning to frame departure as cruelty rather than self protection. When you attempt to leave someone who claims to need you desperately, you become cast as the heartless abandoner in both your own mind and potentially in the eyes of others who witness the situation. This creates powerful narrative control for the abuser. They position themselves as the vulnerable party, deserving compassion, while framing you as a person whose selfishness threatens their well being. Friends, family members, and observers who witness these dynamics often respond with sympathy for the struggling partner and, implicit or explicit, pressure you to remain so you can be supportive of them. The abuser gains social protection through appearing fragile while you face social pressure to continue providing care regardless of the relationship's impact on your own well being. The timing patterns of these threats reveal their manipulative nature clearly. During the relationship, the groundwork gets laid through subtle, often loving expressions of dependency. "I need you so much. What would I do without you? I would fall apart if it wasn't for you." These statements, delivered gently and affectionately, create the foundation of future threats by establishing your role as their primary source of stability and worth. When you attempt to assert independence or leave, these gentle expressions transform into desperate pleas that activate all of that prior conditioning. The same words that once felt like expressions of love become weapons of entrapment screamed in crisis moments. This dual delivery makes distinguishing between genuine affection and strategic manipulation extremely difficult, even in retrospect. The psychological impact involves constant responsibility for another person's stability. The abuser may couple self destruction threats with other manipulation tactics to reinforce their effectiveness. They might threaten to spread information about how you abandoned them in their time of need, creating social isolation. They may also expand the framework to characterize your normal needs, boundaries, and expressions of independence as threats to their mental stability, making authentic relationship communication impossible without risking their threatened collapse. When this threat pattern becomes a framework for broader relationship control, your fundamental needs for autonomy, respect, and authentic connection become framed as selfish actions that endanger someone who depends on you completely. The psychological impact becomes particularly complex because normal relationship expectations get twisted into evidence of your cruelty towards someone who claims to need your constant support for basic survival. They make their breakdown your duty, and that duty becomes a lock that keeps you inside the abusive relationship. Next is threats of legal and system weaponization. Legal and system weaponization threats create one of the most paralyzing forms of entrapment. They exploit institutions designed to protect victims of abuse, like police and courts and social services and even professional licensing bodies, by threatening to file false reports that would trigger an investigation. The abuser doesn't actually have to file them in this moment. The threat alone is enough. The idea that those systems could be unleashed against you at any time becomes the punishment. Abusers who use this tactic understand exactly how these systems work. They know that every false allegation must be treated as credible until proven otherwise. The abuser describes to their victim in detail the kind of complaint they could file, the fabricated evidence they could produce, the damage it would cause. They don't need to follow through because they know the threat alone can control you. The power of this threat lies in the consequences it implies. False claims of domestic violence would result in restraining orders, loss of security clearance, and immediate restrictions on seeing your children. Fabricated complaints to professional licensing bodies could suspend your ability to work. Allegations of parental neglect would bring social services to your home, setting off assessments and proceedings that could drag on for months or even years. Each of these processes carries real damaging outcomes, regardless of whether the allegations collapse later. For men, these threats carry extremely real and damaging weight. Culturally, there is a strong bias towards believing accusations against men in cases of family violence. Men are not only assumed guilty until proven innocent, they are often treated as guilty even after being proven innocent. The accusation itself leaves a permanent mark. Even when threats never materialize into real reports, the possibility alone carries the weight of social judgment. Men know that a cleared investigation does not erase the suspicion and doubt that it seeds. It does not mend the damage with extended family or undo the reputational harm within the community. And the abuser knows this when they make that threat. An abuser who threatens to make false reports understands this cultural reality. They know that once the accusation is out there, the system will act immediately. The community will form judgments quickly, and those judgments rarely fully reverse. That's the real entrapment here. Knowing that the truth may eventually clear you in court of law, but it may never restore what you lose along the way. The psychological effect of these threats is paralyzing. You begin to view institutions not as avenues of protection, but as weapons that have already been turned against you. The thought of having to defend yourself against fabricated allegations feels overwhelming. And I can tell you from experience, having been through this, there are times it does get overwhelming. You understand that an accusation alone, even if only threatened, will taint your reputation in ways that will never fully disappear, even after the truth comes out. The truth does not always set you free. Survivors of abuse here often find themselves hesitant to ever call the police and reluctant to approach social services. The institutions that should provide protection become symbols of risk when there are threats in the air. That mistrust becomes part of the abuser's legacy, limiting your ability to trust systems designed to safeguard you and discourage you from ever fully accessing them again. Let's now shift to the tools that you can use to protect yourself. Protecting yourself from entrapment threats means shifting the way you respond in the moment and the way you prepare behind the scenes. These threats work because they aim to trigger panic and shame and helplessness. They only work if you absorb them silently and then carry them as truth. When you learn to document, to respond with calm precision, and to test the reality of what's being said, you begin to break the cycle of entrapment. The first tool is simple but powerful, which is name the threat. Most abusers deliver threats in a way that can be deniable. They want you to feel the fear, but not have the words you can hold them to later. If you calmly say, that sounds like a threat, you drag the tactic out into the open. When you do this with steadiness, no raised voice, no defensiveness, it can force the abuser to backtrack. You remove the covert layer that gives the threat its power. Even if they don't admit it, you've created a record in the moment that their words were not normal conflict, they were coercive. The second tool is documentation. Every time a threat is made, capture it. Screenshots, voice note, a written record after the fact, whatever is safe and possible. Documentation achieves two things. It creates evidence if legal or professional systems later weaponized, and it shifts the threat from something you carry alone in your head to something external and objective. When it's written down, you can look at it with your clear eyes. The third tool is build external anchors. Abusers know isolation makes threats like this heavier. Keep contact with one or two trusted allies, even when you feel ashamed or afraid. A quiet ally who knows the truth is a counterweight against the fear that everyone will believe her. This doesn't require oversharing or pleading for validation. A simple, steady connection with someone who sees your reality breaks the illusion that her threats define your truth. The fourth tool is legal and system literacy. Many threats require your ignorance on how institutions actually work. I'll make sure you never see your kids again. I'll have you arrested. I'll destroy your career. These sound like absolute threats because they prey on your fear. In reality, systems require process, evidence, and review. Consulting with a lawyer or a specialist before threats escalate don't just prepare you legally, it dismantles the mythology of these threats. When you know the process, the timelines, and your rights, the fear loses its edge. Finally, the most important tool is psychological separation. Each threat is designed to fuse your identity with fear. If she says it, it must be possible. If she threatens it, it must be inevitable. The truth is that a threat is not an outcome. It's just a tactic. When you learn to pause, breathe, and name it for what it is, a tactic, you create space between the words and your reality. That space is where your power can return. Each of these tools works by pulling the power back into your hands. Documenting, narrowing scope, preparing quietly, and leaning on quiet allies all remind you that threats are tactics, not destiny. They are meant to paralyze, but they lose strength the moment you respond with steadiness and clarity. The more you practice these small protections, the more the walls of entrapment begin to show their cracks. Freedom begins with seeing these threats for what they really are, just tools of control. They are not guarantees of outcome. The power lies in the fear they create, not in the certainty of what will follow. The moment you can separate the threat from the truth, you begin to reclaim ground that was lost. Freedom comes when you realize that abusers do not have the power over you that they have made you think they have. The restoration doesn't come at all at once. It comes in steady proof that the threats lose power when faced with truth, support, and preparation. In time, the voice of the abuser becomes smaller. The voice inside you, the one that says you deserve safety, dignity, and peace, grows stronger. Freedom is not just the absence of threat, it is the recovery of your own voice, your own choices, and your own future. That's the exit. That is the restoration. Thank you for listening. This will also be my last video for the next couple of weeks as I am away on holiday. I'll return after with a fresh perspective and new content. In the meantime, I encourage you to revisit my earlier videos, sit with the tools that we've covered, and allow yourself space to reflect on what they mean for your own journey. Thank you. This is Stand Again, lived experience platform for male survivors of family violence. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice might just help another man find his. If you're looking for one on one support, you can book coaching with a member of the Stand Again team. Simply visit standagain.com.au, where you will also find grounded information on surviving and recovering from family violence as a man. As always, remember that no matter how many times you've been knocked down, you can stand again.